Afternoon, everybody. Jim McCauley here. I'm the LOC's Legislative Director. Thanks for joining us on our weekly Friday legislative webinar. A couple of things to note. Please make sure that you get your microphone muted unless you're specifically asked to unmute yourself for a question. If you've not yet done so, please make sure that you identify yourself by name and the city or organization that you represent. Instructions for how to change your identifying information are located in the chat. This webinar is a public space, open to all, and is being recorded, so keep that in mind with your comments and the questions. Questions from attendees will be held until the LOC lobby team has had a chance to provide our entire update for this afternoon. And we will do everything possible to make sure the webinar ends by 1 o'clock. You can also follow LOC's legislative activities from our website at www.orcities.org. For today's legislative webinar, we're going to be covering the following topics. We're going to provide a status report on the governor's housing bill, as well as housing budgets, economic development legislation, community broadband meetings, and then I'm going to do my best to try to capture debt ceiling conversation that was able to pass actually the Senate just this last night. So it's been a pretty eventful week for sure at the federal level with the conversations over debt ceiling. We are in, I think, week 5 of the Republican Senate walkout. The House is still doing business. There are actually several committees that are still doing business on a daily basis and actually include any number of Republicans at the dais for those committee meetings. They're just not coming into the Senate floor and are preventing Senate leadership from being able to move legislation through the process. So the backup that is in place right now is certainly, I think, well over 200 pieces of legislation, including budgets from virtually the majority of all these state agencies that are in place at this point in time. So with that, I'd like to get Scott Winkles on, and he can provide us a bit of an update on where session is at and potentially what we might be doing in the future. So with that, Scott, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Jim. I'll give a sort of a brief overview of what's going on with the session generally in terms of the walkout. I think you saw earlier this week that the governor announced that she had engaged in some negotiations with the Senate Rs, then announced that those had broken down. The following day, Senate President Wagner announced on the floor that starting Monday, senators with unexcused absences would be fined, I believe it was $350 a day going forward. So they will be getting some sort of a summons and then an invoice for that effort. We also saw Senate Republicans form a sort of a shadow hearing, shadow cabinet type hearing, sort of minority party event where they invited folks to show up and talk about issues of corruption within the legislature. So it's getting very entrenched. It's getting there's a very personal tinge to all of this. On top of the looking at the sort of the options that the legislature has, the Senate has to compel its members to show up. We've also saw today some sort of inducements as well. So they're putting forward some funding packages for parts of the state where these senators are from. Saw a rural investment package today, which isn't unique at this time of session, but what is interesting is that it came from the offices of the presiding officers, not the legislators' districts. And so some investments in John Day, Central Eastern Oregon, announced without the benefiting senator on board. So I think they're trying to provide inducements to the districts as well to provide some pressure. The reality is I think there are a lot of folks of us in the building who've been there for a while who note that this feels like a different sort of event than previous walkouts. I'm not sure how much hope most of us have for resuming the session. The continuing resolution funds most agencies until September 15th. There are gaps in that continuing resolution. One of them is quite concerning to us. Hopefully the E-Board would be able to reach a quorum and fund DPSST. That service is critical, but that's where we are for now. I suspect, I do encourage people who want to follow this to focus on some of your traditional media sources. I think Capitol Chronicle has produced some pretty good material on this. Stay away from Twitter and the social media. I think you get what people are saying, not necessarily what's actually happening. But I think our legacy media sources, newspapers, the TV stations are doing a pretty good job of covering this as well, and that's where I encourage folks to follow. And you have my contact information if you want more questions. So hopefully I won't be giving this update next week, but I suspect I might.
Thanks very much, Scott. Yeah, this is, I think the one point that I really want to stress for everybody out there is that your lobby team, we of course are still coming to work. We are still finding ourselves in the building. We're still testifying. We're still having the contact with legislators to make sure that we are doing everything possible, that we are queuing up our priorities for the remainder of the session, and to at least get them in a place so that when that window does open, we'll be ready to go. So we haven't stopped our advocacy work during this time frame, which again is unprecedented and has gone well beyond the walkouts that we've seen in the past in 21 and in 19. So with that, I'm going to shift to our legislative topics today. And first up will be Ariel Nelson. She handles all of the land use, housing, homelessness issues, and she's got some updates. So go ahead, Ariel.
Thanks, Jim. So the bill that's been taking a large part of my focus is on housing and land use is the governor's housing bill, House Bill 3414. So the latest update on that bill is received a public hearing, another public hearing in the House Rules Committee yesterday afternoon. We're now on to the -14 amendment, which is what was heard yesterday. And this amendment is a reflection of negotiations between Speaker Rayfield's, led by Speaker Rayfield, Representative Dexter, who's the House Housing Chair, and Representative Gamba. So they've been working together on this and kind of negotiating with the governor's office and incorporating feedback from stakeholders, including LOC, city expert feedback. The discussions at this point have gotten really technical. So this is the bill. If you haven't tuned in before or need a reminder, what it does is it requires all cities to provide adjustments for housing development applications, or some people call it a variance. We're calling it an adjustment in this bill for things like development and design standards. The bill also stands up a new housing accountability and production office between DLCD and the Building Codes Division that would kind of investigate or look into implementation of housing laws at the local level. So the -14 amendment is a massive improvement from where we started with how the bill was introduced in the governor's office. And previously, if you were engaged in advocacy or following our action alerts, we worked with Representative Gamba to introduce a -5 that kind of restructured the bill in a way that's actually workable for cities to implement. It's still not a policy that I think we feel is the right tool to be addressing the housing crisis, and that we're not sure that it's going to have the impacts that some folks do, but we're also, open to additional flexibilities and development standards. So this -14 is really in large part thanks to the leadership and advocacy of Representative Gamba, former mayor. He was the one that introduced the -5s on our behalf. And so the 14 is based on our structure, our proposal, the -5s. And there's some additional policy changes in there that we're not getting everything that we want in the bill, but it is at least workable. It's at least implementable for cities. And so next step is the amendment, these Dash 14 amendments just came out yesterday, midday, just a couple hours before the hearing. Cities, planners and councils have been reviewing them, and structurally it's pretty much there. We're kind of outside the realm of additional negotiations, but we do need some technical clarifications in the language to make sure that cities can implement this bill with minimal delay, confusion, and litigation. So that's what we're working on right now is I have to get together kind of a final list of what are the technical things that we want clarified in the language. And then I think we'll expect potentially a Dash 15. And then based on what you heard from Scott and Jim and what we're kind of predicting for the session, it will likely get rolled into a larger like housing budget package and prepped and teed up for the special session, a forthcoming special session, or if we come back to get the legislature come back together to pass for a session. There is funding in here as well for local governments. There's $10 million now in this latest amendment for technical assistance that would go through that housing office, such that if a city identifies code updates or streamlines that they want to do, work that they want to do to increase effectiveness or housing production, they can get funding through the office. And then if the office receives a complaint or is made aware of things that need to be fixed in a city's code, then they would, and there's different enforcement mechanisms in that office, but it kind of starts with a letter and like a voluntary work plan and things like that. And there would be resources available if a city is directed to make updates through that office. So we'll be looking for that technical amendment, and then hoping that we can kind of put that to rest. And the other key thing that we got in the bill is a requirement for DLCD to report to the relevant committee in the House and the legislature every 2 years on how this is going. And it specifically says the LOC will be invited to report as well. So not a reporting burden on us, but the ability to come and have city specifically say, this is what we're experiencing implementing this law, and here's what's working or not working and needs to be adjusted.
Ariel, thanks very much for that. I mean, I think, folks, one thing to recognize out of Ariel's work and the partners that she has been working with from well before session started on this subject is these are incremental changes that are only being changed because of our advocacy and because of Ariel's work. And I think the collective push that we've had during this entire legislative process. So that's really important to call out as we're going forward, because we still got some more steps to take to try to get this into a more palatable form, and to make sure that not just this legislation, but other things that we continue to work on continues to improve over time. Very rarely do you have a piece of legislation that gets introduced on day one that still has the same language by the time it gets a signature from the governor. Let's move to economic development. This has been a long-term conversation as well. We actually just got out of some hearings earlier this morning on the latest on some of the economic development incentives that are pretty critical for semiconductor package, but a lot of other economic investments across the state, especially in the rural communities that are out there. So Lindsay, who handles tax policy for us, as well as economic development. You've got the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures, which is ultimately the committee that will decide, or the committee that our local economic development incentives will go through, mainly enterprise zones and the SIP and gain share program, had two public hearings that they opened jointly this morning, both on House Bill 2009 and Senate Bill 1084. I have talked about these bills over the past couple of weeks, but Senate Bill 1084 originally came out of the Semiconductor Task Force recommendations and represented the sort of suite of economic development incentives designed to help Oregon companies attract CHIPS dollars and also grow other investments. That's chiefly where LOC got involved in the semiconductor work in the first place. Regardless of the Semiconductor Task Force recommendations, we would have been advocating for the enterprise zone extension, especially because it would have been up for review this year as it expires in 2025. So we have been working with coalition of other local government partners and economic development partners on a reasonable set of upgrades to these economic development programs that are in Senate Bill 1084. On the House side, they kind of packaged what their proposals are for enterprise zones, SIP gain share, and the R&D tax credit. And that's what sits in House Bill 2009 right now. We are supportive of Senate Bill 1084 and less so on 2009, but it is a sort of sticky situation to be in because that bill does have an enterprise zone extension, which we want, and some other provisions that we are opposed to. So the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures held public hearings on both of those bills this morning and opened them jointly. At the start of the hearing, we heard from Chair Nathanson about a proposed amendment, most likely to House Bill 2009. And part of the reason why they might be moving forward with that bill at that point is just procedurally, it could get through the House. If the Senate continues to not be able to pass bills on the floor, they could at least move one vehicle through one chamber. But one of the big changes that we heard this morning is that they're thinking about adding a community service fee for schools to enterprise zone agreements. So the school district portion of property tax revenue has been a large part of the conversation around enterprise zones. Some school organizations have testified that enterprise zones, hurt school district revenue. And the original proposal to deal with that was to require that companies pay their school district portion of the property tax abatement after a certain number of years. We have expressed concern about that, that it would greatly reduce the incentive and limit cities' abilities to negotiate other community service or other community benefits out of those negotiations. So the alternative proposal that was shared this morning is adding a community service fee to enterprise zones. So they mentioned that the SIP agreements have something similar. In SIP agreements, companies either pay 25% of their property tax savings or 2.5 million a year. 2.5 million is the cap. So that's the maximum that a company will have to pay. So we haven't seen the specific proposal for what that would look like on an enterprise zone agreement, or if there's percentages or what the threshold would be. So I think we're waiting to see what that would look like before taking an official position on that provision. But that's where the conversation on enterprise zones is headed right now. And I'm currently trying to work with the chair to see what that proposal will look like. And then ultimately we'll be waiting to see what another amendment to House Bill 2009 is, and what the overall compromise for these economic development programs ends up being.
Right. Thanks very much, Lindsay. If I'm not mistaken, I think today was hearing number 8 over the course of the session that we have had on any number of the different economic development incentives that are out there, ranging again from E-zones to SIP gain share to R&D tax credits, et cetera, et cetera. And I think overall, I think anybody who's had a chance to watch those hearings or sit in those hearings, it has been absolutely overwhelming support for these sunset extensions and to make sure that these programs going forward still present a viable economic development incentive. This is the last thing we need to be doing, is to basically scale them back in terms of value and in terms of effectiveness. So we'll have to wait and see if we end up with another hearing before this session ends up closing, and kind of what we end up doing from this point forward. Thanks again. Nolan, You are next up with broadband. I think specifically some of the community broadband meetings that are taking place.
Thank you, Jim. Yes. So hopefully I can keep this quick, but next week, the Oregon Broadband Office will be holding the final set of in-person community broadband listening sessions. The sessions next week will be held in the Dalles, Baker City, Ontario, Burns, and Redmond. A final virtual session will be held on June 22nd, and that meeting is available for anyone. And I would highly encourage anyone who has not attended any of the meetings so far to try to at least attend that virtual meeting. The registration link for all of these meetings and the virtual meetings are in today's bulletin. And if you represent these communities or are in a nearby community for next week's in-person meetings, please consider attending to provide feedback and ensure that your community's needs are highlighted. These are open to you as elected officials and to city staff, but they are also open to your community members. There are links to flyers that are also available in today's bulletin that you can share out with your community, either on social media or printing and posting in various places. The feedback the broadband office receives will be critical for how the state's broadband plan is created for the BEAD funding and how it will ultimately be implemented. They are really encouraging cities to weigh in on the different barriers, the challenges and experiences that they have, but also that their local businesses, educational institutions, healthcare, and the list goes on, but about the impacts that they are seeing on access to the internet. Broadband, as you all know, is a critical economic development tool for your communities. And this is really our opportunity to make sure that city voices are heard and are reflected in the broadband plan. I would especially say for our rural areas where the bulk of the funding will be centered, but also to note that in many of our urban spaces where there are underserved and historically underserved communities. Again, next week's meetings are the final set of in-person meetings with a final virtual meeting that will be held on the 22nd. Again, the links to register are going to be in today's bulletin. You can also find that on the Broadband Office's website, but look at today's bulletin for all the relevant information you need. And just, again, really highly encourage you to show up and make sure your voices are heard in this process. I'll note that recent indications show that Oregon will potentially receive more funding for BEAD than we were initially allocated or expected to get, I should say. That is due to a lot of the work from folks challenging the broadband fabric that was put out by the FCC to highlight additional unserved and underserved locations. So there's going to be a lot of money coming to Oregon, and we want to make sure that how this is being spent and rolled out works for our members. So look at today's bulletin, see if any of these meetings in person will work for you. And if not, again, there's that virtual meeting at the end of the month.
Nolan, thanks very much for that. I know you can't get into the details of like how much money, but are we talking $50 million? Is it something, in the hundreds of millions of dollars? I mean, what type of an infusion are we expecting to see? Because I think it helps with scale and maybe the value of folks coming to going to these community meetings.
No, it's a very good point. So we are expecting about $157 million from ARPA. But then additionally, we were originally projected up to $500 million from BEAD, with the additional locations being added. I have heard that we might receive an additional $200 million. So anywhere from, I would say, $700 million to $900 million we could potentially get. We will know on June 30th what our allocation will be from BEAD. But regardless, please know there is a lot of money that's going to be come out here to really help our communities to make sure that we have adequate access to broadband. But this is really our opportunity to weigh into this process, because before we can access the BEAD funding, the state has to write a broadband plan. This is our opportunity as cities to make sure that we are included in that process and that our barriers and challenges are reflected.
Thanks. That's really helpful, I think, for folks to hear that piece of it, because I think when you look at this on scale with some of the infrastructure investments that are being made in water, as an example, these broadband funds are capable of are basically blowing past anything that we've seen committed on water projects, just as an example in terms of infrastructure. And they've got the ability, I think, to really take a giant chunk out of those underserved populations and underserved regions of this state. So pretty important infrastructure coming forward. And Nolan and all the partners and stuff out there have really been pushing the broadband office to make sure that they're covering everything as comprehensively as possible. So I'm next up, and I'm not going to try to go through 99 pages of this debt ceiling work that's been pretty much a 24/7 negotiation process between congressional leadership as well as the president's office. We had a kind of a front row seat to at least get a little bit of a briefing on this a few weeks back when Patty Mulvihill, our executive director, along with Mayor Steve Calloway, current president for LOC, and pretty interesting time to be back in DC. I don't think anybody was expecting back then that we were going to hit this, I'll say June 5th deadline on trying to get an agreement, because they were so far apart. But there was an awful lot of work that was done on this. And I think at the end of the day, the compromise that they ended up reaching in this is probably not a bad place to be going forward. There's a couple of key top line pieces that I think are worth flagging for folks. We've also got a story on this that's summarized top line plus some of the details that came out of this debt ceiling. So first piece of this is that the suspension of the debt ceiling is going to be extended into January of 2025. That's a fair amount of time. It's going to be after the 24 election cycle. And that's going to be helpful, I think, for a lot of reasons to basically take a breath as we're going for this. The discretionary spending over the next 10 years is going to be cut by 1.3 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And that is going to essentially be some savings of close to $1.5 trillion by the time you look at the interest payments and things of that nature. For the fiscal year 2023, the new ceiling for those defense or non-defense spending is essentially becomes a ceiling. So basically, whatever we had in place for spending in 2023 is going to be the new ceiling going forward for this next fiscal year into 24. And again, that's non-defense spending only. I think the big piece for cities that National League of Cities have been fighting for, and I think there's a number of folks who've had the chance to reach out to their own elected officials, is that the American Rescue Plan funding that came forward, the bill does not, the main piece on this is that the bill does not rescind that money that was transferred or that was sent directly to cities. And that's a good thing. Essentially, it came down to a description of what was obligated money versus not. And effectively, once the state received that funding from the federal agencies, it became obligated, and essentially it was no longer part of the mix of what was going to be seeking a clawback. So that's a good thing for cities that have yet to spend all of that federal funding that came in through ARPA and through some of those state and local fiscal recovery funds that at the end of the day. A couple of interesting things that I think are worthy of pointing out, and this kind of goes again to how the funding went out the door and those states that have spent it more effectively have obligated. So when you look at the transportation piece itself, there are several states out there that didn't obligate transportation funding. Louisiana, as an example, 69% of the funding that they have received or targeted receiving from the feds was not obligated, and they're going to lose it. Michigan, about 68% of their transportation funding, as an example, was not obligated. And again, that's going back to the feds. Oregon, good on them, is ODOT obligated every cent that came through the state as part of some of that federal funding. So that's all good as well. So there's a lot more detail on this in the article that's in the bulletin, and I suggest you take a look at it. But there's again some compromises that took place. There's some hits that are going to have some impacts on people for sure. But overall, we've got essentially additional 2 years. We've got a budget that's going to be signed here shortly by the president, and we can get on to dealing with other issues at the federal level. So with that, I want to move to some of the Q&A for the remainder of our time. So for those of you who haven't been here before, certainly you can put a question into chat, and that's actually where I'm going to start first. Please make sure that if you don't want to put it in the chat or don't have that option, you can certainly raise your hand and we can get to you as well. We'll try to focus on our city officials and electeds before we move to other people who may have questions in the queue. So first question up is I'm looking at the chat function right now is from Nancy Brewer from Lebanon. Essentially, there are questions about funding that comes to cities if the legislature does not complete their work. Will grants or revenue sharing be held up? So Nancy, if you have the ability to come on, maybe a little bit more detail might be helpful. But with that, I think between Lindsay and Scott, if you've got maybe a response.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that I can add right now is that we do have a continuing resolution through September 15th. So budget, everything that's to do with the budget will continue as normal until that point. I think, Scott, do you want to jump in?
So yeah, Lindsay is correct on the shared revenue as it applies to grants that require an appropriation. The shared revenue formula is established in statute based on what the state takes in. So the liquor revenue will continue to be distributed based on that formula. The I believe the same, and Jim, jump in. I'm not as familiar with this statute as the liquor one, but the transportation money is also prescribed by existing statute based on what comes in, as opposed to requiring the legislature to appropriate our shared revenue. So I don't think those streams will be interrupted.
Ariel, I saw you muted, so go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add for grants, I think it's going to kind of depend a little bit about the agency and the program that you're dealing with. If it's a grant that you already have, that was presumably probably this current biennium funding. So that's already existing. It's not something that will get held up. But if you're asking about, future grants that you wanted to come in and apply for, it's going to depend on the agency. If that was something that's funded through current service level, kind of baked into the baseline budget of an agency, it may still be available. But if it's not, like, for example, I work closely with DLCD. If you're looking at a land use planning grant, those are typically approved on a biennial session by session basis. That said, there was some initial funding approved early in House Bill 2001 that moved. That was the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis bill, and there's some initial planning grants available and funding in that bill. So that's already been passed. So it's going to kind of depend on what issue area, what agency you're working with.
Thank you. State grants almost always have an appropriations clause in them, and they may not be captured in a continuing resolution, particularly if it's expected to be new money in a biennium. And I had a feeling the state revenue sharing was going to be okay, but wanted to confirm just as we head towards budget adoption. So thank you.
And if you're worried about if anyone's concerned about a specific grant, or we're kind of planning or expecting certain programs that you're going to be coming in for certain funding, I would encourage you to reach out to those specific agencies and your contacts there. But if you'd like our help connecting or confirming, we're also happy to do that.
That's great. Thanks, everybody. The other part of this too is if you are a city that had a specific project that you had a sponsor for from a legislator, that is something that for sure is in jeopardy until they physically pass a budget, whether it's physically in the programmatic bill at the end, essentially Christmas tree bill, or whether it's physically in a agency budget, those are part of the undecideds that won't get a decision point until Oregon passes a budget. And I think the other broader conversation here is if we look at a special session, which won't come before June 25th. Statutorily, they have to move, they cannot have a special session before the end of a statutory sine die. So there's potential end of June, July, or some other time here between now and the continuing resolution runs out in September. But bottom line there is they're going to have to decide on what legislation will be discussed during those during that special session. And I think the focus is certainly going to be on funding and budget related pieces, but some of these budget items also have policy implications. And I think there's going to be a rush or an effort, certainly on our behalf, on some pieces to try to get some policy bills that have significant revenue impacts in terms of being able to generate revenue, as an example, to make sure that those get discussed as quickly as possible in this process. So keep that in mind. And I'll use as an example the small city allotment program, which, you know, is a value for those cities who are 5,000 and less. ODOT is going forward with their current cycle for their award process and that $5 million. So that's something that's already been programmed into their budget cycle, and that's not something that's going to be in danger at this point in time. Let me go next question on this. So this is from Courtney in Reedsport. If the enterprise zone fee is enacted or otherwise, do we have a sense if it's going to affect current enterprise zones or if it's just going to be focused on those that are renewed or new ones?
Yeah, that's a good question. I answered it in the chat, but I'll do it for everyone else. So in House Bill 2009, which is the likely vehicle to move forward, it does explicitly state that any of these changes only affect future agreements. So it wouldn't impact any EZ applications that have already been approved. I think it's a good question whether or not it would impact renewal of those agreements. I could see that going either way. So I will check on that and get back to y'all with the sure answer on that one.
Great. Thanks very much, Lindsay. So with that, that is all of the questions that were in the chat. So this is open mic time, I guess, or essentially open question time. So I will hold and see what hands come up, or if we get folks that come on screen to ask a question. Peter from Haynes, go ahead.
Okay, this is about the broadband thing. Now, what does the infrastructure include? Does it include antennas where you can basically set up antennas that can move so that the internet from one remote community to another, or is it just the lines in the dirt? I mean, what does the infrastructure include?
It's a good question. Fiber. So both ARPA and BEAD heavily rely on use of fiber. That is the most reliable, it's future proof. So that's a lot of what the infrastructure is really focused on. So the funding can be used for middle mile networks to connect cities that currently do not have any access, so that you can then use that to connect the last mile network folks. Those are your end users, typically your homes and businesses within a community. So this is really focused on fiber lines.
That help?
Okay.
Excellent. Anybody else with questions? I can hold for another minute or so, but I don't want to have people stay on the line if you don't have questions. I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Again, I appreciate everybody taking the time to join us on these Friday webinars. Hopefully you find them helpful, informative, and please make sure you keep your contact up with your legislators. those relationships are going to be continue to be really pivotal for the league and for all cities to be able to advance your priorities going forward. We'll decide next week on whether or not we're going to be doing another one of these next Friday, or if this is going to be the last one of this particular session. But so stay tuned on the communication coming out of the league, your bulletin, and any other legislative communication that we end up having. So everybody have a good weekend, and again, appreciate you joining us today.